February 17th, 1944. Somewhere west of Korsun, Ukraine, a cold, frozen swamp dominates the landscape. Inside Panzer 312, everything is gray and white. It's cramped here, and the air is thick with the smells of diesel, sweat, and the distant scent of fear. Hauptmann Klaus Richter, who leads this massive 56-ton Tiger tank, presses his eye against the periscope. The view through the optics is impressive, showcasing German engineering at its best. Unfortunately, the swirling snow makes it hard to see anything clearly. His crew has been inside this metal box for hours, waiting and watching. Below him, Corporal Steiner, the gunner, is humming a tune, his hands resting on the controls of the formidable 8.8 Semper KV-36 cannon, nicknamed the 88. It's the king of the battlefield, successfully taking down Soviet tanks like the T-34 and KV-1. Richter trusts that cannon more than he trusts most of his superiors. "See anything, Hauptmann?" Steiner mutters, his voice barely cutting through the hum of the Maybach engine. "Just ghosts," Richter replies, scanning the area left and right through the periscope. The snow keeps falling, covering a field littered with destroyed birch trees and the remains of a T-34 they had obliterated the day before. Winter in Ukraine has buried everything in mud and ice, and they are part of the force trying to free German divisions trapped in the Korsun Pocket. It's a tough, relentless fight. Suddenly, Richter's loader, a young lad named Eric, tenses. "Movement on the left flank. 10 o'clock. Richter quickly brings the periscope back around. At first, he sees nothing but the white snow swaying gently. Then, a silhouette emerges from the woods about 100-200 meters away. Big, low, and intimidating. It's not a T-34. Its turret is too round and massive. It looks like a KV heavy tank, but bigger and far more menacing. "Steiner, target at 10 o'clock. Unknown heavy tank," Richter says, keeping his voice calm and steady. "Panic isn't an option right now." "I see it," Steiner responds, now focusing intently on the target. The turret of the Tiger begins moving slowly to face the incoming threat, accompanied by a hydraulic whine. "Looks like a new KV model. Bigger gun," he analyzes. As the shape becomes clearer, moving through the deep snow, Richter realizes it's an absolute behemoth. The sloped hull is designed to deflect incoming shells, and its turret is a solid piece of steel, topped with a cannon that looks like it should be mounted on a battleship. "Range is 100 meters, Steiner reports. "Panzer Granite 39 loaded," he adds, referring to the armor-piercing shell, the Tiger's best ammunition. "Fire when ready," Richter commands. The inside of the tank is suddenly filled with a deafening roar, and Richter feels a violent jolt as the 88 fires, sending a shell flying at over 800 meters per second. The air fills with the acrid smell of burnt gunpowder as they all watch the tracer round rise and then disappear across the snowy terrain. It's a perfect shot, hitting the mystery tank squarely on its upper armor. But then there's an explosion of orange and nothing happens. The shell bounces off the Soviet tank's armor, leaving a deep scar but nothing more. It doesn't even slow down. A knot of dread tightens in Richter's stomach. That can't be right. At this distance, his 88 should have punched right through. "Reload!" he barks, his voice trembling with urgency. Eric scrambles to get another 23-pound shell from their supply and slams it into the breach. But they're moving too slowly. Suddenly, a massive orange explosion bursts from the Soviet tank. It's not the quick crack of a usual anti-tank gun. It's a low rumbling boom that seems to shake everything around them. Without thinking, Richter flinches, even though the shot isn't aimed at them. It's aimed at Panzer 314, commanded by his friend Lieutenant Schmidt, just 50 meters away. Richter doesn't see the impact. Instead, he sees the aftermath. In one moment, there's a 56-ton Tiger tank. The next, its turret, an 18-ton block of steel, has been torn from the hull and flung 10 meters into the air like a piece of garbage. Flames erupt from the chassis, instantly incinerating the crew inside. A shockwave hits Panzer 312 a moment later, shaking them violently. Stunned silence falls over the crew in Panzer 312. Eric looks pale as he peers through his vision slit, and the radio crackles with a brief, panicked shout from another tank before cutting off. Steiner grips his controls tightly, his knuckles turning white. "My God, what was that?" he breathes, shocked. Richter leans back again to look through the periscope. The monstrous tank is still there, its massive cannon now slowly turning toward them. It's not just another tank. It's an impending catastrophe, a force of nature cloaked in steel. And now it's their turn in the crosshairs. "Reverse! Get us moving! Now!" Richter's voice burst through the intercom, desperation stripping away any calm he usually maintained. Their driver, Karl, an old hand who had seen it all before, doesn't need telling twice. He slams the gear lever, and the Tiger tank jerks backward, its massive tracks struggling in the deep snow to move the heavy steel beast weighing 56 tons. There's no point in trying to be smooth or strategic now. All that matters is getting away fast. Then comes a sound that tears through the air, a booming explosion right next to Richter's head. He can't see the second shell fired from the massive Soviet tank, but he feels its impact. It explodes in the frozen earth just 10 meters ahead, sending a huge spray of dirt and snow up in the air and showering the Tiger's front with debris. It's like 1,000 hammers slamming against the tank's armor at once. The force of the blast rocks the entire tank. Inside, the crew is tossed around like dice in a cup. Richter's head bangs against the steel rim of the cupola, and stars flash across his vision. A box of ammunition clatters to the floor, and the lights suddenly flicker, bathing the cramped compartment in a frantic strobe effect. "Report!" Richter manages to shout, still reeling from the impact. "Driver's okay! Engine's running!" Karl calls out from the front. "The gun's operational!" Steiner adds, his voice taut with tension. "Hauptmann, I can't get a clean shot. Their armor is too sloped. It's like trying to shoot a pyramid." "Aim for the turret ring! The gun mantlet! Anywhere!" Richter orders, shaking his head to clear it. Looking through the vision slit, he sees the terrifying sight of the Soviet tank slowly advancing with an unrelenting confidence. He can finally make out the number stenciled on its turret. 110. Flanking it are two more of these monsters, followed by a wave of T-34-85 tanks. They're smaller but still dangerous 85mm guns, looking like toys beside the formidable main cannon of the lead tank. This was no mere probing advance. It felt like a sledgehammer coming down. "Target acquired! Firing!" Steiner yells. The 80mm gun booms again. Richter watches the tracer round shootout and strike the Soviet tank's thick gun mantlet. It creates a burst of bright sparks on impact, a direct hit on what they thought was a weak point. But the result is discouraging. The shell only glances off. The Soviet tank barely flinches, its turret continuing to turn without missing a beat. A wave of despair washes over Richter. They were up against a foe that their most powerful weapon couldn't bring down. In just 2 minutes, their Tiger tank, once a proud symbol of German armored strength, felt useless. All those stories about Russian forces being crude and unrefined suddenly seemed so wrong. This machine was nothing short of brutal. It was built to do one thing: destroy Tigers. Suddenly, the radio crackles with an urgent voice from another tank in his platoon. "Panzer 311 is hit. We're burning. The transmission cuts off abruptly into a burst of static. Richter turns and sees it, the wreck of Panzer 311, just 100 meters away, crumpled with a large hole ripped clean through its armor. Thick black smoke is pouring from the crew hatches. No one is getting out of that one. They had thought the first giant tank was a fluke, maybe just a prototype, but now it was clear. This was the new face of the Red Army, the IS-2 tank, named after their leader, Iosif Stalin. The Hammer of Stalin was a fitting name. "Karl, full reverse, get us to the woods for cover. Steiner, fire on the T-34s, hold them off. Eric, load high explosive." Richter's mind races as they shift from being the hunters to the hunted. They can't take down the heavy tanks, but maybe they can at least slow the smaller ones down. The Tiger continues its retreat, firing as it goes. Steiner manages to hit a T-34, and it bursts into flames. A small victory amid the disaster. But the IS tanks ignore them, instead choosing to focus their fire on the other panzers trying to help. Richter watches in horror as the massive 190mm shells rain down on his comrades. Each impact brings destruction, turrets blown off, hulls shattered. The pride of their armored forces is being wiped out. Grabbing the radio, Richter calls out, "All units, this is Tiger 312, disengage. I say again, disengage. Fall back to the secondary line. Avoid the new heavies, they're invulnerable to 88mm fire. Repeat, our shells aren't penetrating." His warning is cut short by another earth-shaking explosion. as a shell meant for them obliterates a cluster of birch trees just ahead. Splinters rain down on the tank's engine deck. They're running now, and for the first time in his career, Klaus Richter feels no shame. He feels pure fear. The retreat felt like a wild and frantic escape. The engine of the Tiger tank roared as Karl pushed it to its limits, skidding through the slush and snow. They still had about 300 meters to reach the relative safety of the thick pine trees nearby. Behind them, the battlefield was a cacophony of destruction. The booming blasts from the IS-2 tank's 122mm cannons echoed like a bass drum, marking the end of German tanks one after another. The sharper cracks of the 80mm and 75mm guns were desperate replies from their side. "Smoke! Launch smoke!" Richter shouted, his voice strained. On cue, the S-mine dischargers on the tank fired, releasing canisters that filled the air with thick white clouds of chemical smoke. For those few moments, Panzer 312 was momentarily obscured, vanishing into the winter fog. It wasn't much, just a small trick to buy them time, but it was all they could manage. Inside the tank's turret, the tension was palpable. Eric, the loader, was working quickly and mechanically, sweat trickling down his young face despite the cold air. He was loading heavy shells into the breech, alternating between high explosive and armor-piercing rounds, each move charged with adrenaline. Meanwhile, Steiner, keeping his eye glued to the sight, scanned the blizzard-like scene for threats. "They're coming through the smoke," he reported flatly. "I can see their shapes. 3 of them. Still coming." The IS-2s weren't in a hurry. They seemed to glide forward with the slow inevitability of glaciers, crushing everything in their way. Their confidence was palpable. Why rush when the enemy was so clearly outmatched? The psychological toll was just as damaging as the physical. These German tankers, who'd triumphed against overwhelming odds before, were now facing an unstoppable foe that not only outnumbered them but outgunned them as well. It felt as if their faith in their machines and in the very ideals of the Panzerwaffe was crumbling with every bullet that struck home. Then, a new sound tore through the noise of battle, a shrill, eerie cry. "Sturmovix!" Karl shouted from the driver's seat. Richter didn't even need his periscope to know what was coming. He recognized the roar of the Ilyushin Il-2s, the flying tanks, as the Russians called them. They swooped low over the battlefield, firing their 23mm cannons, ripping into the snow and blasting through the weaker armor of the German tanks. Rockets flew from their wings, exploding with fiery shrapnel that filled the air. The Soviets were executing a well-coordinated strike, combining their air and ground forces to wipe out the relief unit. Suddenly, one of the rockets hit close to the Tiger's right track, and the vehicle jerked violently to the side. All the lights flickered off, plunging the crew into pitch darkness. The engine sputtered, coughed, and then fell silent. That silence was even scarier than the chaos they had just experienced. "Status!" Richter shouted into the darkness. Moments later, the emergency lights flickered on, casting unsettling shadows around the cramped interior. "We're hit," Karl replied, his voice strained with pain. Something came through the floor. "My leg. I think it's broken. I can't get the engine started again." They were now sitting ducks, trapped in a 56-ton steel coffin in the freezing snow, while danger closed in around them. Steiner manually turned the turret, the crank groaning under the strain. "Hauptmann, look." Richter moved up to the gunner's auxiliary sight. One of the IS-2s, unmistakably marked 110, had stopped its advance. It was about 800 meters away, its massive gun steadily aimed right at them. The enemy tank knew they were in trouble and took its time, savoring the thought of the kill. The other Soviet tanks were skirting around, targeting the remnants of the German company, leaving the giant to deal with the wounded Tiger. This felt like the end. Richter thought of his wife in Berlin, the last letter he had sent her just a week ago, filled with bravado and complaints about the cold winter. It seemed like a cruel joke. "Eric," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "Load Panzergranate 40. The loader hesitated. The Piesgürter 40 was a rare tungsten-cored round, a trick-shot shell designed for long range with great penetration. They only had 5 of them, and they were typically unreliable at longer distances. "Hauptmann?" Eric asked. "Load it," Richter insisted, keeping his eyes locked on the approaching enemy. "Steiner, when he reloads, he'll be vulnerable. His gun will be raised slightly. Aim for the bottom turret front, right where it meets the hull. Don't miss. The chances of success felt slim, yet it was better to take a shot than to go down without a fight. Eric managed to load the special round, and the sound of the breech slamming shut echoed like a final act of defiance. Through the powerful optics, they focused on the IS-2. They caught a glimpse of the commander's hatch opening briefly, followed by the massive barrel dipping before rising as the Soviet loader prepared another round. "Now, Steiner," Richter whispered, "for the fatherland." Without answering, Steiner concentrated fully on the crosshairs, his heart racing. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, then exhaled slowly. His finger tightened on the trigger, and the world around him narrowed to a single point. This one moment of hope in an overwhelming sea of despair. Inside the Tiger tank, there's an eerie quiet. The only sounds are the hurried beats of the four men's hearts and the distant chaos of a battle they can feel slipping away. They're holding their breaths, and time feels stretched and warped. A suspended moment balanced between life and death. Richter peers through his periscope, mirroring what Steiner sees just a short distance away. He spots the IS-2 tank, marked as 110, standing ominously in the snow. Its gun barrel is beginning to droop, signaling it's about to fire. "Fire," Richter whispers, almost like a prayer. The 88 opens up with a crack, sharper and more intense than usual. The tungsten cord shell, lighter and quicker, bolts from the muzzle at an impressive speed of over 930 meters per second. For just a brief instant, the crew of Panzer 312 sees the tracer round, a small streak of light racing through the muted sky. And it hits, not with a clang of metal or the dull thud of missing the target. It strikes precisely where Steiner aimed, the vulnerable shot trap on the lower part of the IS-2's gun shield. Designed to penetrate armor, the round burrows into the sloped metal, rather than deflecting away. It crashes into the weakest section of the hull, right above where the driver sits, just in front of the turret. For a heartbeat, silence reigns. Richter's stomach drops. He fears that even their best shot might have missed its mark. Then he spots a thin wisp of black smoke escaping from where the shell hit, quickly followed by a thicker plume. There's fire inside the tank. Moments later, with a muffled whoosh, the driver's hatch of the IS-2 bursts open from the inside, and flames erupt. The giant tank is wounded. The massive 122mm gun, which just seconds ago was poised to fire, now hangs limply, immobilized. "We got it! We really got it!" Eric exclaims, a mix of disbelief and joy brightening his voice. "It's not out of the fight yet," Steiner quickly reminds them, already working the traverse wheel to line up for another shot. "Eric, load another round. Now!" However, the crew of the IS-2 isn't done for. They start to back away, clumsily maneuvering as one track moves slower than the other. Smoke gushing from the front of the tank turns thick and dark. Its turret begins to turn away from them, a slow retreat as it tries to shield itself with its intact comrades. "They're trying to escape," Steiner shouts, frustration coloring his words. "I can't get a clear shot." "Hit their tracks. We've got to immobilize it," Richter commands, now focused and determined, thoughts racing like a predator eyeing its prey. Eric slams the second tungsten round into the chamber and fires again. The 88 roars, but the shot goes wide, sending up a spray of snow just behind the retreating tank. The IS-2 takes cover behind a burning Panzerwaffe, half obscured from view. The immediate danger has lessened, but they're not out of the woods yet. The sounds of battle are far too close for comfort now. Richter can hear the staccato of heavy machine gun fire and the shouts of Russian infantry getting nearer. The Soviet T-34s, having taken care of the other Panzers, are advancing with their infantry to finish off any survivors. "Karl, can you get the engine going?" Richter's voice rings out urgently. "I'm trying, Hauptmann. I think that hit messed up the fuel line. It's coughing and sputtering, but it just won't start." Karl responds through gritted teeth, the strain evident in his voice as they all can hear the motor groaning in protest. Richter studies the battlefield through his periscope. The odds don't look good. To their right, a squad of Soviet soldiers in winter whites is moving forward, using the craters for cover. They're less than 200 meters away. On their left, two T-34-85 tanks are positioning themselves to get a clear shot at their exposed side. The Tiger they're in feels like a doomed metal box. and death is closing in swiftly. Erich Steiner, man the machine guns, Richter orders with a grim resolve. We're holding our ground here. Carl, keep at it. If you get that engine running, don't wait for my word. Just drive for the trees. Go. He opens his cupola hatch, pushing the heavy steel plate open a few inches. The frigid air rushes in, bringing the smells of snow, burnt gunpowder, and melting metal. He grabs the MP-40 submachine gun that's clipped against the turret wall, checking its magazine. This is how it ends, not in a grand showdown against another tank, but in a desperate fight against unseen soldiers in a bleak winter landscape. He can see the faces of the Soviet troops now, determined, hard men with PPSH-41 submachine guns at the ready. One soldier points towards the Tiger, shouting instructions to his comrades. A bullet zings off the turret, then another one follows. The final act of this battle has begun.